So I'd like to begin our last session for the day, introducing my two speakers. Dr. Kathirasan K, calling Dr. KK for short, is a renowned thought leader, keynote speaker, philosopher, artist, and author based in Singapore. He's the founder of Center of Mindfulness and the Mindfulness Academy, with a flair of holistic thinking and expertise in merging diverse systems. Kathirasan is committed to his life's mission, which is about enhancing self-awareness, both for himself and others through his various roles. Sam is a digital architect, widely learned across different disciplines of science, engineering, design, and philosophy. Sam developed the first nationally recognized volunteer award platform in 2019, earning the prestigious New Zealand High Tech Award in 2021. Today, he works at the intersection where well-being meets emerging technology. He's leading innovation projects and building infrastructure to not only enable digital transformation, but the transformation of self in relation with the world. So the use of self is a pretty common concept. But I would like to just spend a bit of time to set the context for everybody. Some of you may not be working in the field of OD, so you may not be as familiar. Right? We came out with this topic from a convergence of many different conversations, where we exchange ideas of psychology, organizational development, good relations, philosophy, religion, and well-being. It feels like the world is at a ontological convergence, a threshold, where we reach a stage where we have to change our thinking or face an existential threat. So the use of self is a very common concept around OD practitioners, facilitators, coaches, psychotherapists. It talks about us and what we bring into the system when we work with clients, be it an individual in a coaching conversation, counseling session, or group dialogue, or group therapy even. As a concept, we understand what it means. When we enter a system, we inherently change the dynamics of the system. Because of who we are, we have our own beliefs and our values, our own assumptions, our biases, motivations, intentions, our fears, physical, emotional states. And consciously or unconsciously, we bring that along with us, and it impacts the outcome of our work. So Mien Chong Judge, somebody who, a member who has since passed on, is somebody we respect a lot, talks about aspects of self, which are hardwired as a structure. But self is also a process, because self doesn't exist in isolation, but occurs at the point of contact and in relation to the environment. In such interactions, we trigger the group, and the group triggers us. Right? Different identities are being activated, roles are developed, relational dynamics are formed. All kinds of individual and group relations start to emerge. It could be an in-group, out-group phenomenon. There could be collusion, projections, transference and counter-transference, dependencies, and many other forms of defense mechanisms and behaviors. So such is the impact of self. But what exactly is self? That's something we want to explore a bit further in this particular segment, the self and the consciousness aspect. There are many different perspectives to self. Right? Materialists see self as purely physical. It is just biology and neural activities. René Descartes, a dualist, separates the thinking mind and physical body in his famous quote, "I doubt, therefore I think, and therefore I am." It asserts that mind and body are separate entities, and self transcends physical existence. Existentialism explores the meaning, the purpose, and values of human existence, and that self is not predetermined, but is continually created through one's actions and decisions. Right. There are many other perspectives, but I'll pause here and maybe start the discussion going with my panelists by posing a question. So, how would you make sense of the concept of self, and how is that linked to consciousness?
Okay, would you like to take the honor for this one?
All right, great. Firstly, thank you for having me here in this forum where we're going to learn together. It's a pleasure being here. Now, before I answer the question, rather an inquiry into the nature of the self, I want to qualify that I'm not giving you the answer. I think I'm just offering a perspective. And it's through perspectives that we actually expand our horizons in terms of how we understand realities. So I want to qualify before I begin to respond to the question that I'm offering a perspective. So when we talk about the self, the most powerful term that enables the inquiry into the self is the pronoun I. We use this pronoun I daily, actually. But the moment we use this pronoun, it reveals the fact that we are aware of the self. Because the I allows us to create what we call as a locus. I creates an opportunity to identify a location, a locus of the self. So whenever I make a statement, I am, it only proves that I exist. So what is this I? I think it's a great question, and that's what Iki has invited all of us to think about. Now, I would like to give a very quick response before I also like to hear Sam's response as well. The quick response that I want to share is the I that we use so liberally, we use it every day, probably more than a dozen times, maybe 100 times possibly, using this I, it shifts its location, which we don't see sometimes. Now, when I say that I am hungry, the I shifts to the body or the tummy or the stomach. When I say that I am angry, the I shifts to an emotion or the mind. When I say I am happy, again, the I shifts to the mind, the form of an emotion. When I say I am intelligent, again, the I shifts to a state of the mind which revolves around knowledge. So if you realize in the world that we relate with, we use the word I so liberally, and it keeps shifting its location, which then leads us to the question, what is this I? And maybe at this point, instead of answering the question, maybe it's good to think about it. And I'm going to stop here at this moment. Over to you, Sam.
Thank you so much, KK. And I love that so much. It is the contemplation of I. Who is this I? Is the inquiry, I feel, that opens up a doorway to such great contemplations of our relationship with the world. And I still remember the first time I had a conversation with Iki. But before I actually get into that part, I also want to just take this moment and really appreciate everyone here. Thank you so much for this opportunity to share a little bit of my perspective, similar to how KK shared. I feel that in tonight's contemplations, I too am also offering a perspective. And to offer this perspective in front of everyone who has all the domain and knowledge of behavioral science, and then coming from outside, how did I find myself in this situation? How is it that I am speaking about this topic? And so this, again, inquiry of I is such a topic of unknowns. It's such a topic in domain of exploration. So I'm both humbled and honored to have this opportunity today. When I first met Iki, I remember having this exact conversation. I asked, oh, so what is it that you do in your occupation? And he shared with me it was to do with organization transformation and self-development. I was so curious because this topic of organization development, when we peel back the layers of what is an organization, it is a collection of people. But when we dig a little bit deeper and see beyond the group of people, it is each individual person. But in each individual person, when we go even deeper into that, it is something inherently called the self. But the self, I feel, also is made up of so many different layers. And a lot of these different layers we're actually quite familiar with, I feel, in our daily life. So it led me to this contemplation that in the same way that who I am and how I make sense of the self is very different to who am I in the self when I'm in my family, the self that I bring to work, the self that I am with my loved ones, my personal relationships. These are very different elements and dimensions of self. We're very familiar in the role, relationship, and what we can say is the contextualization of self. In the contextualization of self, in this context of education, I'm a student, maybe I'm a teacher. In the context of the self, in the workplace, maybe I'm the digital architect. In the context of my family, the self is a son, is an elder brother. But the contemplation, to go a little bit deeper, is who is the self beyond all of these contexts? And that is, I feel, what it is that we're exploring today. And again, my very humble perspective, when I contemplate this question, the self needs to have contextualization, and within that contextualization, there is our role, our relationship, and our responsibility. These three things are inextricably bound. For example, if I am a father and I have a son, but I haven't been there for my son for much of his upbringing, can I really say that my role as a father? Can I really say that father and son is our relationship? In the same way, if I haven't been there for myself, to be there for the part of myself with my emotions, to be truthful to my feelings, what is the relationship with myself? And so the role, relationship, and responsibility within the context is needed in this context to hold this notion of self. So I'll pause there as well, and hopefully that has contextualized the self a little bit more.
Thank you both. So what I'm hearing is that when you think about our roles and relationships and our responsibilities, it requires us to be really conscious of who we are and what do we bring into the system. So I think that's the overarching concept of what the use of self is all about. How about the intention to make an impact into the system? How would we be in a position where we are able to do what is best at that point in time?
I see that every role has an element that governs its well-being. Now, if I am a leader, then that leader, the particular leader's well-being has to be understood. And in the same way, when you talk about a staff or a colleague, everyone's role has a particular specific set of roles and responsibilities. And that's why how roles are created. In organizational context, like the one like Sam shared, a father too has supposedly some kind of roles. It's either created or it's also influenced by expectations, norms, culture. So many things come together to determine that. So each of this role has a certain, what I call idea or a construct with respect to what constitutes well-being. So when we make intentions, the question then is, does this intention serve this well-being? Serve the well-being of this role? That is one question that I would say is very, very, very helpful in any, even in an organizational context or even in a personal context. Because me as a person, I play multiple roles. I could be a father, I could be a husband, I could be a leader, I could be an employee, I could be playing so many roles. But do I inquire into the well-being of each of this role? Now, do I do that, or do I just take for granted that the well-being of one role is applicable and relevant to another role, but it may not be so? And that's the reason why sometimes roles come into conflict. So each of the roles' value and its well-being could be very unique. That's my first response. My second and last response is that the intention that we are making. Now, are we making these intentions after understanding the nature of the self or before? Now, that's a very important question, because because like the way I started my sharing is the fact that we use the I, and we use the I so liberally, but we do not investigate or inquire into the nature of the I. And without perhaps inquiring and understanding the nature of the I, we have already set intentions. It's like not knowing the full capacity of the car and how it works, but I've already started to plan a ride, right? Right. So that's a very important point. I don't know what this car is, but I'm already planning for a ride. I'm already planning. I'm picking up a map and making, coming up with my, my pit stops, or where am I going to stop? Where am I going to take a break? But I've not understood that vehicle. Now, so that illustration tells us that, does the setting of intention, does it come after the recognition of the self, or does it come before? If it comes before, then there is a chance of failure. There is a chance of suffering. There's a chance of disappointment. All of the negative affect that we're not comfortable with is bound to be experienced. But knowing it, if I knew the nature of the self and then I set intentions, it's like knowing the capacity and the full capability of the car, and then charting out a journey that would allow the car to be well. And also making plans based on what the car can deliver. So these are my two responses for now.
Thank you. Love that. Okay.
I'd also like to explore a little bit more. It's such a great analogy about the car and the driver. And I feel like the car and the driver, the car is the vehicle, like this body, but the driver is the awareness. When we lose the awareness of the self, then we start to drive this vehicle, this body, into all different situations that get us into a lot of trouble. We know what a collision looks like in the physical sense when we drive a car and we hit something. But do we also know what the collision looks like when we don't have that self-awareness and we drive into something and we hit a relationship? In that situation, it all comes back to, just like that analogy, the driver and the car, the awareness and this vehicle that we use to navigate this world. And more of a exploring this perception, I think the self and the perception of self, I want to share a short story. There's a really great story from the Zen tradition. It's called the One-Eyed Monk. I'm not sure if anyone has heard about the story of the One-Eyed Monk, but it goes a little something like this. There were once two brother monks studying and living together in the same temple. The elder one was learned, but the younger one was still learning. Not as experienced, and he only had one eye. The two brothers would provide lodging to any traveler who would engage with them in meaningful dialogue. But if during the dialogue, the traveler comes to experience some kind of insight, they would then be compelled to move on to the next temple to share their insight, to share their new self-realization. One day, a wandering traveler came to seek lodging, and he was ready to earn his stay. The elder brother, tired from that day of much studying, asked the younger one to take his place. But he cautioned, "You should go and request the dialogue in silence." So the younger brother and the stranger went to the shrine room and sat down. Shortly after, the traveler rose and went to the elder brother, and he said, "Your brother is such a wonderful fellow. He helped me to experience a new realization. Relate the dialogue to me," said the elder brother. "Well," explained the traveler, "first I held up one finger, representing Buddha. And then he held up two fingers, signifying Buddha and his teaching. I held up 3 fingers, representing Buddha, his teaching, and his disciples, living a harmonious life. He then shook his clenched fist in my face, indicating that all 3 come from one realization. Thus, I experienced a great enlightenment. So thank you so much, but I must move on and share this realization with more practitioners. With this, the traveler left. The younger one stormed in and said, "Where is that fellow?" Running to his elder brother in anger and great frustration. His elder brother said, "I understand that you helped our traveler reach a great realization. Well done." And the younger brother said, "I did nothing. I want to beat him up." Curious, the elder brother asked, "Relate the dialogue to me." Why, the minute I saw him, he held up to me 1 finger, insulting me that I only have 1 eye. Since he was a stranger, I decided to be courteous and thoughtful, and I politely said to him that between 2 of us, we have 2 eyes. In his audacity, he held up 3 fingers, saying that between all of us, we have 3 eyes. I then went up and was about to punch him, but then he ran away. And that ended it. So what is it to be gleaned from this story? What it is, I feel the relationship between the self and perception is that before there is perception, there is consciousness of perception. And what it is I've come to learn is that there are 5 consciousness and also 5 perceptions. The consciousness that we're very familiar with is actually the consciousness of our sensory consciousness, our eyes, our ears, nose, our taste, and our feel, the touch of this body. The second is the consciousness of the body of our emotion. When we feel courageous, when we feel fear, when we feel joyful, when we feel happy, we feel that in our body. The third consciousness is the consciousness that we're quite familiar with, is our brain consciousness. The consciousness of ideas and consciousness of thoughts and frameworks. The 4th consciousness, we can say, is the consciousness, the deeper subconscious, the consciousness where is the consciousness of our dreams. We feel that our dreams are so real that they're even more real than reality. And the 4th consciousness is the consciousness, what we can say, our soul consciousness. And so these 5 consciousness also have 5 different perceptions. In the same way that the young monk was using the consciousness and perceiving the traveler, he perceived what the message the traveler was conveying to him. He only used the consciousness of his sight, his emotion, and his brain consciousness. But the traveler, the perception that he held was really activating that deeper consciousness with that deeper perception to see beyond what it was just the maybe physical elements of this poor guy, and to reach deeper into his larger context of self that comes from his tradition of practice. And those 5 consciousness really reminds me of the quote from Margaret Thatcher, and I'll paraphrase a little bit. How one sees determines how we think. How one thinks determines how we feel. How we feel determines how we act. And how we act across time determines our character. Our character across time. determines our destiny. So we're very familiar with our perceptions. We're very familiar with our character. But how familiar are we with the consciousness behind our character? How familiar are we of the consciousness behind our perception? So the use of self requires a deep perception of self, while the perception of self requires a deep awareness of self. So this relationship between self and consciousness, when we cultivate our self-awareness, we have greater capacity for our self-reflection. With greater self-reflection comes greater self-perception. That process we can call self-cultivation. That process we can call the greater context. Well, now how we can take that into our role, relationship, and responsibilities across all our different domains of using self as an instrument. Okay.
Thank you so much, Sam. I love it that you're bringing in self-cultivation, because I think that also links to what we are trying to talk about. What exactly are we cultivating? Right? What I'm hearing so far, there's the nature of the self, there's awareness of the self, the intention that we are setting, our roles, our relationship and responsibilities, and the different levels of consciousness that we are able to activate. It feels that it links very well together. So the self-awareness is really being aware of ourselves, our emotional state, our physical state, values, beliefs, assumptions, patterns of behaviors. And then when we are able to reach that level of awareness, we can move into our intentions. There are many different types of intentions out there. We have to recognize that. But assuming that our intention is pure, that will mean compassion, that will mean love, kindness. These are all powerful forces that can create huge impact with whoever we are working with. I'm also reminded of Maslow's hierarchy. So we are very familiar with the 5 levels. But before Maslow passed on, he started thinking about a 6th level of the hierarchy, which is about self-transcendence. What he realized is that the first 5 levels that is very familiar with all of us tends to be very much focused on self, right? My needs, my requirements for esteem, my requirements for belonging, my requirements for my self-actualization. So he was thinking that at all these 5 levels doesn't really satisfy our needs for meaning and purpose. So he introduced a 6th level called self-transcendence, which in fact is really just going beyond self, purely in service of others. So how that translates is that, let's say if I'm a parent, I want to be the best parent possible to raise my children to be the best of themselves. But how much of that is purely for the child? How much of that is also corrupted? But my ego to be wanting to be the best parent, my ego to want to be loved by my child, right? So he realized that a lot of people stays in the self-actualization stage where they still have some selfish need that they are trying to fulfill for themselves. So self-transcendence is going beyond that. It is purely doing things in service of others. Reaching a state where we are at one with humanity, one with nature, one with this universe. Almost feels like this is what it means to have a single consciousness, right? Now that I remember the 13th century Persian poet Rumi has this particular quote: "You are not a drop in the ocean, you are the ocean in the drop." So in a single consciousness, interconnected, interdependent. So if we imagine ourselves, if we look at everything and everyone as an extension of ourselves, what will be our actions like? What will be our behaviors like? What will be our intentions like? How will the world be? So we will be all separated, distinct and unique, and we are all independent, but at the same time, we are all part of one single consciousness. So how then will we be able to set an intention of cultivating life? Right. So that's the thought that's emerging as I listen to the both of you. Any other thoughts? Anything that is coming up for you?
I'd love to hear the thoughts from our audience, actually. Perhaps this could be a good opportunity as well to engage in that meaningful dialogue. Because again, you know, I'm here just to share some small perspective, but what it is I'd love to hear is everyone's perspective.
Yeah. So raise your hands if you want to join the discussion, ask a question, make a comment. How do I
see a
pronounce your name?
Kashima.
Kashma? Please go ahead.
Hey, hi. My name is Shama. I'm from
Hi,
India.
Shama.
Namaste. So use of self is something, and I see it from individuality perspective, and also, and maybe I'll take it kind of understand or kind of discuss it with respect to. I'm also an OD practitioner, so from that lens, maybe I'd like to kind of discuss it. Um, Also being a manager. Um, so any and everything, let's say a picture that we get, let's say we all of us are sitting in a theater and we get to watch a movie, or all of us get to read an article. Okay, but use of self primarily how well the consciousness, how well how well do we really kind of are we really aware of the solution, from setting it up from the organization perspective. So from the theatrical perspective, everybody whosoever watches the movie, the meaning that they are going to take it back, and the story that they are going to kind of tell it. So when you tell them to narrate the story, any of the favorite movie that you watch, it the element that you will share will have the element of the self. So what is it that you see in a movie will always have an element of you in that. How do you really narrate that story? And similarly, how does this really boils down to even everything that we do? So let's say organization problem, for that matter. Let's say a problem. I'll just say a simple common example of retrenchment, or a marketing drive per se. So how do I as a person see an opportunity in a market, or a threat in a market? Is how do I really see myself? How do I really use myself? So a person may see an opportunity in a market like India, where for artificial intelligence per se. The same other person may not really see it like an opportunity. Having said that, because we are also the kind of economy where many of us are not even having a bank account. So I kind of take it, so use of self is something which is so essential in everything and in everything that we do, that if one is and this has, so your explanation of consciousness has kind of now I'll be more conscious while kind of really playing different roles. So who am I when I'm kind of designing the solution for an organization, when I'm going back and I'm designing a solution, when I'm reaching back and I'm speaking with a partner, with my partner, when I'm reaching out to a child. So who am I in that space? Am I the one who's getting learning something, or am I really playing somebody who thinks that I'm ahead and I am being the one who teaches, or I am the one who thinks that can give a solution, while the solution will itself emerge eventually. So I think it's one of the strongest, and I think one of the very, very relevant concept, and thank you for sharing that. It's kind of a life changing, I'd say, a concept for everyone, only if we can fine play this element well. That's my humble submission. And yeah, I'd read something that I had kind of written from both of you. I want to qualify that I am not giving an answer. I'm only offering a perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Shama. Any response from either of our two panelists?
Yeah, I think that Kshama did a great job of asking the questions and also answering the questions. And that's the beauty of asking questions and to just think about it, to dwell in it. And I think she demonstrated that so well to the point that I'm walking away learning something from what she shared. Yeah, I think that's the power of questions. That's the power of inquiry itself. That's the only thing I want to share. Thank you, Kshama.
Thank you. Jimmy, please go ahead. Oh, sorry, Sam. Yeah, please respond, Sam.
Oh, no. Maybe it will be very well tied in with Jimmy's question as well.
Number one, thank you very much for this presentation. Something I'm reading and I read, and one of the fellows whom I was reading was Eckhart Tolle about death. And what you have talked to me is really inspiring. However, bringing it to our world here of organization, see, organizations, as you said, there are persons, but the main job of any organization is it produces service or it produces product, banking service, education, and it produces cars. Now, when you talk of intentions, there is individual, the owner's intentions, and the collective intentions of the laborers. Where do they match? And there is a conflict, there is a collusion. Yeah. And therefore, if you want to create organizations which are people-centric, which are developmental, which are learning, therefore, there is also both the individual consciousness, which is rising beyond just the physical profiteering and beyond. And so has to be a collective. And therefore, you look at organization, how Karl Marx looks at organization, or how Gandhi here in India looked at, or how Ambedkar looks at economy of production. And therefore, it's fascinating how you connect that to organization. Otherwise, OD practice remains only how do you produce more service and more product, but all geared to profit. Your response. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jimmy. I'm very inspired by this question because you made the mention that organizations produce either services or products. But I would endeavor to make a small shift and maybe think in the perspective as, how about if I am the greatest service and I am the greatest product? And how do I cultivate that so that I can become the greatest service and become the greatest product? You mentioned that there were sort of two forces at play. There's the forces of the laborers and the forces of the business owner. This ties in very well with what it means to use the self as an instrument in this context. I feel the key here is that when one's perception of self is only limited within the role that we function, these are my responsibilities, these is my role as an employee is in relationship to my employer. That is the role. And that is the perception of self at that level. But when we go into the perception of self at the business owner level, it's more something like my role is to the community or to the market. My relationship is to serve maybe it's a conglomerate multinational, is to serve that relationship, and that is my responsibility. So inherently, what it is that we actually see is there's a gap between what is the perception of self. So therefore, there must be a perception or a gap in the self-interest. So then how can it not be that there will always be this conflict? So what means use the self as an instrument in this way and to extend the use of self such that I'm not just limited by my perception of self as an employee. My perception of self is actually can be extended into my team. And now all of a sudden I absorb and inherit all of the capabilities of my team. Further than that, I can extend my perception of self to be my entire department. Now, my entire department, I have all the resource and capacity and capabilities of my entire department. This is like the driver of the car and the greater vehicle. Before, we were driving a small vehicle. Now we're driving a big vehicle. What happens when our perception of self extends so great that it becomes inextricable between self, family, community, nation, the world, and all living beings? What would the self as an instrument look like in the context of all living beings? Let alone, lest we can talk more about it, a small organization. At that point, we are not serving self-interest. At that point, we are serving our self-nature. That is our natural state of self, the interconnectedness of all living beings. So thank you very much, Jimmy. Really inspired by your question.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Now, I'm going to jump in to add something to what Sam had said. I'm going to keep it very brief so that we can discuss more questions. All right. Is that okay, Iki? Right. So
Please go ahead.
Yeah, Jimmy, given the fact that you are connecting from India, it actually triggered a response for me because there is this great economist in India in the past by the name of Kautilya. I'm not sure you're familiar with that very ancient economist. Now, in his works, he offered something very interesting to what Sam has been alluding to, which is there are two types of contracts in a business. The first one is called a business contract. The second one is called a social contract. Now, he says when an employee or a staff meets a businessman or an entrepreneur, the first thing they need to cross is the business contract. Now, when we look at it from a business contract, this is where we are basically agreeing on what we're going to receive in exchange. Now, once that bridge has been crossed, Kautilya says, that's when you now kick into the social contract, which is consciousness. Now, once that business contract is done, and that has been signed off, now you meet each other not as a boss and employee, but you meet each other as persons. I think it's a very beautiful perspective. Amazing, because it acknowledges that it is two forms of consciousness that are interacting once the business contract is done. So the moment we see each other as relational beings, as social beings, it presupposes the existence of consciousness. And that too, I would venture to say, a unitary consciousness that exists in me and it also exists in you. That's why we wake up in the morning. All of us have a universal desire. It doesn't matter whether I'm in Manhattan or in Ethiopia. I want to be happy, isn't it? Right? It's a fact. We wake up in the morning. We want the day to be great because I want to be happy. That presupposes a unitary consciousness that influences and governs the way that I relate with the world, isn't it? So to summarize, the moment we cross that business contract and move into a social contract, that's when we acknowledge the humanity that is within you and I. And when we see it from that standpoint, then we treat each other in a very different way. Kindness would manifest in the way that I would relate. Compassion would kick in. I would want to listen to you. I would not want to order you around, perhaps. Completely, the behavior changes when we acknowledge and recognize this unitary consciousness when we move from the business contract to social contract. But the challenge that I've seen as a business leader and also an OD consulting, managing an OD consulting company, is that seldom and rarely people move out of the business contract. And when we are stuck with the business contract, we cease to relate with each other as human beings. That's it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both. That connects very well to what we were talking about in terms of warm data earlier on in the earlier session, right? So how do we see beyond the transaction to go into the relational aspect? Ed, over to you.
Yes, thank you. Well, thank you very much for the presentations in detail about self-perception, consciousness, and so on. I just want to build on the idea of unitary consciousness, and Sam talked about connectedness that we have, and EK referred to Maslow's self-transcendence notion. So, as I listened to you, as much as I appreciated the differentiations and the conceptualization, it seemed like a lot of work. In other words, we're developing this consciousness is all up to us. We got to do this, we got to do that, and so there is, as you probably know, I mean, a lot of talk about universal consciousness, one mind. That gets more into the spiritual side of things, but and it seems like when folks are in that frame of mind, they're talking about maybe letting go, surrendering, letting the ego go, and then that something will flood in from the universe, as it will. I mean, in many ways, we're thinking about that, but I wonder if you all have that as part of your metaphysics about consciousness and self.
Okay. This is a very powerful question, because I feel like there is something to be explored beyond what it is that we know, more than just our material. You mentioned a key word. You mentioned there's a lot of spiritual work here.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like in the same way, we work so hard in this material world for our career and our job. How come we don't bring that same work into our emotional world, into our mental world, into also our spiritual world? And I feel like one big part of it is we've lost the inherent play, that sense of play that is so important to what means the self-work. The real self-work, when we do it, the more we do, the more we want to do it. But the kind of work that is begrudging and laborious, we have this tendency to only know how to work with our body and know how to work with our mind. And then the body and the mind, when it's exhausted, it becomes very consuming for us, that kind of work. But what it is and how it is I benefit from my own work on myself, or what maybe Carl Jung will call the shadow work, or the unconscious part of the self, is that in realizing so much of what it is, in the hidden layers of our consciousness, the more we work on that, the more potential that we realize into this world. That is what when Maslow mentioned self-actualization. But the more we work on that, and the more we realize about ourselves, the more we realize that we are so connected with one another, that the more that I do in my work, not only do I benefit myself, but I benefit everyone. And when everyone benefits, in turn, I also benefit. That kind of work then creates this feedback loop where the more we want to work, the more we work on that, the more we want to work on that. And it becomes so recharging. So I think for that particular point of it is hard, but it's only difficult if we are using the body and the mind. When we are using that other faculties of our consciousness, the deeper, working on our deeper subconscious, working with our, say, soul conscious, that kind of consciousness is limitless energy. And how it is I've experienced that in my own spiritual experience, that will be a story for another day. Thank you, Edwin.
Yeah. We're in this materialist paradigm, and a lot of people are talking about maybe a consciousness paradigm. It's a shift of, well, going back to what you said, a shift of how we see things. What is fundamental? For example, do we see material things as fundamental, or do we see this consciousness as fundamental? For example.
So the one last thing I want to add there after that was, I believe, was it also Eckhart Tolle that said, we are not a body having we are not a human having a spiritual experience. We are spiritual beings having a human experience.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I agree with that.
Just want to also use this opportunity to introduce Ed's book. So Ed wrote a book called Liminal Consciousness. So it's available on Amazon if you are interested to explore. So NTR, we are going to be exploring a lot more into the use of consciousness into our programs. So do keep yourself updated in terms of what are some of the new programs coming up. Kirat.
Thanks, KK and Sam. I was only struck by the metaphor you gave about setting intentions after knowing yourself. The metaphor about the car. You should know your car before you set your intention. If I had done that in my life, I would have remained a small village boy. A village boy in a small, but the fact is, I am a lot more than I know of myself at any time. So when I think of that, I have to set my intention only when I know myself, kind of restricts me very much. So how do I go beyond? I'm hungry to grow. I'm hungry to acquire more knowledge. And I'm hungry to go beyond what I can possibly imagine myself doing right now. So that's what came up for me, and I wanted to state it.
So I want to acknowledge it, what you just said, Kirod, because when we use a metaphor like that, it creates a linear relationship. It presupposes the fact that there is a state that I don't know about, that the state where I don't know about myself, and I'm setting intentions. And then I'm moving to a state where I know myself, and then I set intentions. But knowing oneself is not a binary situation. Knowing oneself is like walking in a dark tunnel, seeing at the end a pin-sized, light. And that discovery of self takes place as I refine my intentions. That's why it worked for you. Because at any point in time, we all have an understanding of ourselves, regardless, even a child has. And with that understanding, we set intentions. And with that intentions, we perform actions. With that actions, we experience results. With those results, we learn. And as we keep setting intentions with the whatever pre-existing understanding of the self, we relate with the world, we keep learning. But the only thing that what I was sharing is, could we continuously set an endeavor to know oneself as we keep relating with the world? It is not that I'm going to stop setting intentions and then, go to a cave and then let me discover myself. That's not going to work. The laboratory in which, the gym in which we are going to do this is right here, right now. And the way that we know ourselves is like the way we walk towards that pin-sized light in the tunnel. It just becomes bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger before you know you are in the light. So this is a process and is a journey, not a destination. So the metaphor may have given the idea that it appears like a linear process to get there. It is not. It is an art of being and doing. Being informs doing, doing informs being. And that's why you are very happy, my friend, and I'm very happy for you.
Okay.
I'm also I resonate a lot when Brother KK, you mentioned it is a journey, not a destination. It's a process, not the final result. And I want to share a little bit more on that. I'm quite inspired by this moment, especially the original intention of this question, because it's about how practicality, how do I cultivate that? Something that I benefit a lot in my last few years. Before I share that part, maybe a short story. There once was a farmer who was hiking the trails in the Alps. He came upon a large egg, and he was amazed by the size of this egg. And so he wanted to take it, he wanted to keep it, wanted to nurture it. And so he brought it back to his farm, and he left it by the hens and allowed the hens to take care of it. Indeed, the hens did, nurtured it over time. And then it started to crack, it started to open. And when it hatched, that egg wasn't just any regular egg. It was a great eagle. And this eagle, as it was growing up, spent its life with the chickens and the hens, and it walked like a hen, it talked like a hen, it ate like a hen, and it became the part of the environment that it was growing up in. And so that eagle never fulfilled its nature of being the eagle. Not to say hens are better or eagles are better, anything like that. Everyone is their nature. But the eagle's nature and the hen's nature and the chicken's nature, very different natures, serve very different purpose in the entire ecosystem. But in this story, what it is that I see this resemblance is that firstly, when it comes to the egg, it's like our world. When we hatch and we come into this world, there needs to be a process where our world breaks. There is a process where everything that we're familiar with, maybe there will be some turbulence and uncertainty along that journey. We've come from the safe confines of our safety worldview, and we've come into a whole new world. And the second is that the environment. How it is I began my journey was after I realized that my worldview was breaking. I had no idea what it was really I wanted in my life. What is my direction and my purpose? And this was a very debilitating time for me. I was very lost. I was very confused until I found a team. I found a group of those who shared the same common aspirations to fulfill their own eagle nature, to fulfill the greatest part of who they are naturally. And so there is this element of this breaking up of the worldview, turbulence, and re-emerging. But in that re-emergence, you have everyone around you that is along the same journey and aligned to the same aspirations of realizing that the greatness of the nature, the inherent nature that's in every one of us. So in the same way that it's a process and not a destination, I feel that it is not only the journey, not only the destination, but who we are together with on that journey. And are we aligned on the same destination towards the same direction? So I feel the big part of that is how we surround ourselves with people who share that same common vision to find that innate nature of fulfilling that greatest potential of self that we can. And that requires self-transcendence. But actually, Karod, I feel like I should be asking you, you have so much more life experience than I do. And that is something that I know is my own limitation, but when we take these opportunities to hear each other, and I learn more, hopefully we do learn more from your life experiences, I get to learn more from myself. And in our own unique experiences, in our unique life experiences, we create a team of collective, subjective experiences that enrich both of us. Now the matter is, how do we? Yeah. So thank you. That's my reflection on that. Thank you, Karad.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sam.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think the question of finding our true nature is a really deep one, right? So who are we really? What is our purpose in life? So I think hoping that NTL can become the environment where we all learn to find our true nature. Thank you. Ted.
Thank you. I'm reflecting on the context, the notion of role and the self in context. And over the time that I have been engaged in this work, which has been a while now, in the 50s, there was a famous book in the US called The Organization Man. And I think the text of it was basically that people who were involved in organizations were completely subsumed in them. That and then came the human growth movement in the U.S., where I think a lot of our effort was and the discovery was that there was a self that was independent of that there was a self that was growing. And I think over time, many of us who were involved in human growth and development in our own began to think of ourselves as being the self, in the same self in all contexts. And so the notion that we can be different expressions of self in different roles and different contexts is very helpful to me. And I think I really appreciate your exploration of the intersection and the relationship of self to community. And I think that one is very, very much, at least in the US, not explored, and we're suffering from it, maybe worldwide. And I think even in NTL, we suffer from, we're so good at knowing ourselves, but not knowing ourselves in community, and not knowing ourselves and not exploring that, and accepting humbly the fact that you point out that we're not independent of that. We're not independent of that interaction and that place. So I'm really appreciating your exploration and helping me explore that. Thank you. I'm not sure that we can get there in the US without, I think those of you who are not in the US, not Western, come from a different culture around community and the place in it, at least from my experience. And I'm grateful for that. I think we have much to learn.
Any
Thank you so much, Ted.
response, KK or Sam? If not, I can just share something, right? So I think, Ted, you're absolutely right. We are a product of the environment. The Industrial Revolution, all the different eras that we have been through, it has conditioned us to what we are today. And that's why we are at this ontological threshold where things have to change. If not, we are not able to survive. Not just the US, but I think humanity. So I think in the past we have been relying a lot on Western science and concepts. It has gotten us to where we need to be. So there's value in it, definitely. But I think we need to now be able to integrate that with something more. Whether we look at different type of religion or philosophies from across the world, each developing in silo by itself. But what we realize is that there's so much convergence in terms of the essence of what it's trying to promote, which is really about all this interconnectedness of humanity. So if we are able to leverage on the wisdom of our forefathers and learn to open our minds and open our hearts to doing and learning things differently, I think there is a potential for us to be able to cross this threshold. It is always a movement. So it's only when we start doing it and we are able to get other people to come along on the journey with us. Yoshiko, over to you.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm actually excited to ask this question because I think this question is for KK, if I may call you KK. When you shared about self as something that moves around, and I wanted to hear more about it because I think Ted mentioned a little bit about this, one self concept that's, prevailing more in the Western literature, but I'm also seeing there's a concept of, multiple selves, right? And so just to make sure I understand your model, like when you talk about self moving around, do you mean with a one self concept, or do you mean it was a multiple self concept? Because depending on how you take yourself as one self or multiple self, the how you understand the roles, it can be totally different. So I just wanted to understand that from you.
Thank you for that question, Yoshiko. So I'm going to give you another illustration to illustrate this point. All right, I'm
Okay.
going to use the metaphor of a diamond. Now, a diamond is of one substance, but it has many cuts. And each cut reflects light in a different direction. Now, in the same way, I look at self as one, roles as many. And each role is not separate from the self. Each role emerges in time, and it may also expire over time. And there is also different ontological status for the self and the roles. So how do I see this? The roles depend on the self, but the self do not depend on the roles. Now, this is a very, very key point. Because otherwise, we may think that the roles are absolute. So when the role suffers, we think that we suffer. It's a very, very important perspective, right? Often when, for example, if I fail as a leader, I assume that I failed. No, it's the leader who failed. I did not fail. So that is the ontological differentiation in terms of its status. So self as one, roles as many. The roles can come and go, self remains. And the nature of this self is unitary consciousness. And this unitary consciousness is not different from my unitary consciousness. Rather, my consciousness is not different from your consciousness from the absolute standpoint. And therefore, it is unitary. So from a philosophical standpoint, philosophers postulate that there is only one consciousness at any point in time. But this one consciousness manifests as you, me, and every being or every object in this universe. So myself, I become the closest thing to this consciousness because it is me. I'm the one who is aware. So therefore, the exploration starts from myself, not starting the inquiry. Yeah, that's right. Because I'm the most closest thing to the consciousness, and I'm the most closest available reality to me. So I start the inquiry in myself and within myself. Does that answer the question?
Yes. And I have wondered if you're also speaking about pre-conscious of self, sort of, taking ourself or selves in a sort of a constellation-like space that we are born into, and then we are part of it already. That's the way I understood your, what is that called? Unitary consciousness. Did I hear you correctly?
Yes, exactly. That's what I'm saying, actually. That's what a lot of philosophies take the view. You're right. We are born in consciousness. We live in consciousness. We dissolve in that consciousness. That's what it is from an absolute standpoint. However, we need the roles to function in the world. Now, that's the relative value of those roles. Without those roles, I cannot relate. So therefore, in no way are we creating a situation where the roles are dismissed. We're not dismissing them. There is a functional value for these roles, though they emerge in time and they disappear in time.
That's all right. Thank you very much. Yes.
Very welcome.
Janet?
Hello. Good morning. I'm just sharing some thoughts that are merging inside of me, which is, I think, the highest value of my time with NTL. I'm a body worker, so I'm always relating life to body. And you had mentioned about, there are no sort of straight lines, so to speak. There's no one direction. And it's important in my mind to always remember there's no straight bone in the body. There's not any linear spot in the body. And that we're built out of joints that either hinge and rotate. So that creates spiral. So we're always spiraling through life but we are built on structures in our education and our value systems in our healthcare systems that are all really, at least in North America, very structured. So we're taking this spiraling soup and putting it into, straight lines, which allows me to learn because I can bounce up against something and then come back and hear myself. And then the other thing I create, a phrase I put on one of my business cards based on my time with NTL, is that bringing the brilliance of our mind into the wisdom of our body. And I think that's a really important, concept to hold to for me personally as a body worker that works with the concepts that I learned through NTL technologies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janet. I love it. We are the spiraling soup put into linear lines. What a great use of metaphor. In this particular moment, I reflect on how in these last few hundred years, looking back at the evolution of humanity in just this short few hundred years, and what has been, I feel, one of the greatest productive marvels of human civilization has been the Industrial Revolution. It has absolutely kickstarted the material layout of being able to build all the infrastructure, to build all the railways, supply chains, global financial markets. It's been excellent to serve that purpose, but it's served that purpose. And in a very similar way, our education system you mentioned has also been a product of the Industrial Revolution. So anything that is a product of the Industrial Revolution therefore becomes an industrial product, and illustrated so well in the Taylor method of being able to systematize everything, break everything down into small little components and run it. That, I feel, has been good to get humanity up to this point for building cities, but it hasn't been sufficient for building life. We've got this great engineering feat and miracles, but how about our own inner engineering? And so, by no coincidence, we put ourselves into this incredible miracle of a spiral soup into this sort of process supply chain that we're doing ourselves a great injustice. What it is that I feel the time calls for now is not an education system, but a new imagination, to reinvent what means education into cultivation. And cultivation, just like soup and Chinese soup, the longer we boil it, the more nutritional it becomes. So perhaps the homemade organic soup pot, more important than the supply chain process soup. Thank you so much, Janet.
I also like the beginning of us, like the egg and sperm, and then the differentiation of ecto, meso, and endodermic layers. All of those layers of ourself are all information seeking. Every single one of us is information seeking, and I think that's important to recognize and realize the life force. And we are also like our life force is because we also have death right as our constant companion, and we live in such a death-phobic culture. So we're really in a conundrum because we don't contain our whole self because we're never allowing our death to be a part of ourself. And I'm also struck by, there was a conversation that we had with Helen some couple of weeks ago in a meeting, but we use the term navel gazing. NTL, we can be so navel gazing, and but we started from the navel. So there's it's another conundrum that we began out of the navel. Those our systems to seek started spiraling out of that navel area. So, but we get ourselves sort of mixed up in our navel gazing. So, which my conversation could be just that. So again, thank you for letting me share.
Thank you so much, Janet.
At this point, I was thinking, Sam and KK, we have been talking about cultivation quite a bit. So how would you suggest in terms of how we continue the journey of self-cultivation?
All right, so let me respond to that first. Now, self-cultivation, just like cultivating any crop, there is always a result that we're looking for, right? That's the reason why I'm cultivating something, which is a very clear goal in mind. In the case of self-cultivation, what is the goal? The way I see it is to recognize that I am this consciousness. That's the goal of self-cultivation. Then the problem is when I look in the mirror, I don't see myself, right? The way that I see consciousness. I don't see consciousness in the mirror when I look at it. So that's the reason why I see as the need or the project of self-cultivation. The project of self-cultivation is to polish the mirror so that it reflects consciousness. And that mirror is the mind. And how do we then polish this mirror of the mind? That is done in various ways, something that Sam already shared. We can cultivate it by starting at the body. We can start with the emotions. We can start with thoughts. We can start with so many different ways. We can start it even in organizations. It's possible. So there is so many ways to actually cultivate. That's the project of self-cultivation. And the beautiful thing is it is so multifaceted to the point where there are so many opportunities. So many opportunities to start. But that requires a very clear intention as to why I am self-cultivating. That's why I had shared earlier. I need to know just as how I cultivate crops because I want results. So I'm also in a journey of self-cultivation, and the goal is to recognize myself to be this being, not just human doing. Now, when that intention is very clear, then self-cultivation becomes a committed pursuit. Otherwise, it becomes it may be there for a few days and then it will disappear. It does not become a priority. So like what Stephen Covey says, begin with the clear end in mind. The end in mind for self-cultivation is to know the self, the nature of the self nature. And self-cultivation is the project. And when I know my self nature to be consciousness, then I'm not just human doing, I'm also human being.
The one question that I'd like to invite everyone to contemplate in regards to this question of how to self-cultivate is, who are we in a world without the world telling us who we should be? Self-cultivation starts there. Throughout much of our lives, we embody so many different roles, become conditioned by so many things, our traumas, our pains, our sufferings. All of this, like KK said, becomes the dust that settle into the beautiful pearl that's inside all of us. Self-cultivation then becomes every day diligently polishing that pearl, cleaning that pearl, removing the dust off of what are the things that no longer serve for our well-being, reevaluating what it is in our life to be surrounded by people who are aligned on that same journey of serving well-being and doing that together. Who are we in a world without the world telling us who we should be? That is the question that invites self-awareness. When we cultivate self-awareness, we get a greater capacity for self-reflection. When we reflect ourselves more, we see the immanent pearl that radiates within each of us. And that gives us a greater perception of self, a greater actualization of self, and a greater use of self as an instrument. So it's not one set answer, but it's subjective to everyone's individual experiences. And that's what makes it beautiful. Self-cultivation is always done together as a team. So find more of those who are also looking for that journey of self-cultivation and do it together.
Thank you so much, Sam and KK. We are almost at time. Are there any last urgent questions, something that's just bursting out that you want to share before we end the session?
I do. One question, sorry. This is Yoshiko, and to both of you, KK and Sam, is that sometime on a journey of self-discovery, and you're really trying to grow to become the person that you could be useful. I could be useful to the world. There's always a moment of failure or discouragement. Any input you have for those moments?
I'm reminded of a wonderful quote that the master fails more than the practitioner has ever tried. So I feel that inherent within failure is only failure because we perceive it as failure. But the times that we do so-called fail are actually the key learning points that become the nutrition for greater growth. How it is I benefit a lot from my own personal failures and my own journey of self-cultivation. 1,000 stories in one. But if I can put it in this way, like Thich Nhat Hanh once said, no mud, no lotus. So all the things that become the pollutant in our lives, all the dust that accumulates on this pearl actually is the nutrition for us to cultivate. And the more we polish that, the more we cultivate that, the more naturally radiant our life. So it's in that way, failure no longer becomes something that we despise, but something that we grow from.
That was beautiful, Sam, by the way. Just offering another perspective. Both success and failure they work on the same premise of cause and effect. Then why do I call one a success and call the other a failure? Because it does not meet my expectations when it comes to failure. And when it meets or exceeds, I call it a success. So you can see, actually, it's still cause and effect. Then why is it then I feel that I can own success, but I don't want to own the failure? The reason being is when something goes well, I take ownership. When something doesn't go well, I find it very difficult to own it. Now, how do we overcome that? In my life, I recognize the way the world is, the way things are, which is this. For any result to happen, I'm not the sole cause. I'm not the one who had caused that result. Even if it is a success, even if it was failure, there are so many other causes contributing to a success that I take ownership, of. So the reason why I feel very disappointed with failure is because I think that I'm the sole cause of that failure. That's not true. And I'm also not the sole cause of that success. There are so many other contributing factors that actually enable something to be successful and something to be not as successful or a failure. So how do I then meet my experience of success and failure? I say I meet it with humility. When I learn to meet my success with humility, then I learn to meet my failure too with humility. And when I bring this humility to my success, when I recognize that so many other factors contributed, so many other people worked so hard for me to be successful, so many of the things were there working well for this to be successful, I would then become humble. And due to that humility, I start learning even when I fail. Then the failure ceases to be a failure. The failure becomes a lesson. Yeah, and so does success. Yeah. That's how I look at it. Yeah.
It's really about the yin and the yang, right? Without failure, success means nothing. It's the same in cooking. In order to bring out the sweetness, we add a little bit of salt. I think there's another saying that says that without mortality, there's no morality. Right? So we know that we have a limited time on this earth. We will die. No, the only truth is living and dying, that we are able to choose the path that we want to take. So thank you so much, Sam and KK. It's been really lovely to have you here and sharing your perspectives. I'm sure there's a lot of comments on chat saying how touched or how impacted people are, and the thinking that's been stimulated, right? So really enjoy your time with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you to each and one of you.